The range was alive with the harsh crack of rifles, the metallic clatter of spent shells, and the sharp scent of gunpowder drifting in the dry summer air, but nobody noticed the small figure standing at the edge of the line until she stepped forward, clutching a rifle that looked far too heavy for her slight frame, and it was at that moment that the man who had been dominating the chatter at the far end, a broad-shouldered SEAL veteran with a chest full of confidence and a tongue sharpened by arrogance, turned and let out a booming laugh that carried over the gunfire, mocking her before she had even taken her place, and he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "What's this, a kid coming to play with the big boys? Don't tell me they're letting Girl Scouts shoot rifles now," and the men around him chuckled in chorus, not because they all agreed but because the bravado of a man like him demanded an audience, and so the sound of ridicule followed her as she set her feet on the dusty ground, checked the safety, and adjusted the stock against her shoulder with quiet precision that betrayed no trace of nerves, though her heartbeat was hammering inside her chest, not from fear but from the challenge she had been waiting for, because ever since she had been a child, watching her father clean his service pistol on the porch and listening to stories of the range, she had dreamed of the day when she would silence every doubter with nothing more than the rhythm of her trigger finger and the steel of her focus, and though her hair was pulled back in a loose braid and her face still carried the softness of youth, her eyes told another story entirely, sharp and unflinching eyes that measured distance, wind, and timing with the instinct of someone born for this, so when she ignored the laughter and slid into firing position, the shift was almost electric, like the air before a storm, drawing a hush from a few observers who saw something in her movements that reminded them of seasoned shooters, the way she placed her cheek to the stock and aligned the sights with a steadiness that should have been impossible for someone who looked like she should be carrying textbooks instead of a rifle, and the man who had mocked her leaned on the counter beside him, smirking with the smug certainty of a predator watching prey, not realizing yet that he was about to witness the slow unraveling of his pride, because when she pulled the trigger the first time, the shot rang out crisp and true, splitting the silence that had settled over the jeering, and the bullet struck dead center on the target 100 yards downrange, no hesitation, no tremor, just clean precision, and a few eyebrows rose. But the man laughed again, dismissing it as beginner's luck, so she fired again and again, each round biting into the same hole until the paper target began to tear, the grouping so tight that even the instructors standing off to the side lowered their binoculars in disbelief, and by the time the fifth shot landed, there was no question of luck, there was only skill, raw and honed through years of secret practice, hours spent lying in the dirt behind her father's barn with a .22 in her hands, breathing with the wind, learning how to still her pulse until it was in rhythm with the world around her, and now here she was, standing among SEALs and veterans and men who thought they had seen everything, showing them that talent does not wear the face they expect. And as the silence grew heavier, the mocking man shifted uncomfortably, his arms crossed now, his grin tightening, because a part of him realized that he had misjudged badly, but pride is a stubborn chain, and so he barked out, "Anyone can hit standing targets, kid, let's see what you do moving." And before the words had finished echoing, the range master activated the shifting targets, silhouettes sliding side to side, popping up and vanishing with mechanical speed, and the girl did not flinch, did not hesitate, she simply inhaled, exhaled, and began to fire, each shot tracking flawlessly, every target struck with surgical accuracy, until even the mechanical whine of the range seemed to pause in disbelief, and the crowd that had once laughed was now silent, their attention riveted to the impossible display before them, and slowly, almost unwillingly, the mocking man found himself leaning forward, his smirk gone, his mind scrambling to reconcile what his eyes were seeing, because in his world skill came from years of grueling training, sweat, and pain, and yet here was a girl half his size dismantling his assumptions one bullet at a time, and though he wanted desperately to laugh again, to find some quip that would restore his dominance, the only sound that came out was the involuntary exhale of a man who realizes he is witnessing something historic, and when the last target fell, there was no cheer, no applause, only the stunned quiet of men who knew records had just been broken, even if the official scorekeepers hadn't yet confirmed it, because in their hearts they already knew, and the girl lowered her rifle with calm dignity, not a trace of arrogance, not even a glance at the man who had mocked her, because she did not need his recognition, she had aimed at something greater, something beyond the smallness of ridicule, and in that silence, where dust drifted through sunlight and spent shells gleamed on the ground, everyone understood that the range would never be the same again, because they had just seen the birth of a legend, and though the mocking man tried to speak, tried to reclaim the attention he had so easily commanded before, the weight of what had just unfolded pressed against his chest, choking the words in his throat, and in that suffocating realization he knew, without anyone needing to say it, that every record he had once held pride in was already in danger, because the girl who had walked onto the line as a subject of laughter had left it as something else entirely, a name that would soon echo through every SEAL training camp and every range where precision was worshipped. And while he stood rooted in silence, she walked away, her braids swinging gently against her back, unaware or perhaps uncaring of the storm she had just unleashed, her mind already set on the next challenge, the next target, the next chance to prove that she was not here to be underestimated, but to rewrite what everyone thought possible. The whispers began before the dust had even settled on the range, a ripple of disbelief passing from one shooter to the next, and though no one dared to say it too loudly, the truth was undeniable. They had witnessed perfection, and perfection was not supposed to come from someone who looked like her. So when the range master stepped forward, his face a careful mask of neutrality though his eyes betrayed a glint of excitement, he asked the young girl to stay behind for a moment after the others cleared their rifles, and his tone, calm and official, carried an undercurrent of weight that made the mocking man's stomach twist, because he knew that when a figure like the master took interest, it meant something serious, and sure enough, the girl remained, standing with her rifle resting against her leg, calm as though this were nothing more than routine, though inside she could feel the electric hum of adrenaline still coursing through her veins, each heartbeat echoing in her ears like the fading crack of the shots she had fired. And as the others packed up and drifted off in tight clusters, murmuring, casting glances back at her as though she were some kind of apparition, the mocking man stayed too, though he told himself it was curiosity, not bruised pride, that rooted him to the spot, and when the range master spoke again, his voice was pitched lower for her ears alone. "How long have you been training?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and the girl answered without hesitation, her words clipped, steady, betraying neither boast nor apology. "As long as I can remember," and though the answer was simple, it carried a resonance that settled deep in the master's bones, because talent that pure was not forged overnight, it was something honed in quiet hours, away from applause, away from recognition, and he nodded slowly, almost reverently, before signaling to one of the assistants to reset the range, this time at full capacity, the most grueling course reserved for SEAL candidates during evaluation drills, a shifting labyrinth of moving targets, obscured silhouettes, environmental distractions, and time limits so brutal that even the best struggled to keep their shots tight. And when the mocking man realized what was happening, he stepped forward, unable to restrain himself, blurting out, "Come on, you can't be serious, this is a Navy test, she's just..." But the master silenced him with a look, one so sharp it cut his protest in half, and the unspoken command was clear. "Stay silent, watch, learn." So he clenched his jaw and folded his arms, though his fists tightened against his biceps, his pride bleeding into resentment, because the idea that this girl could be given a chance to run a SEAL drill felt like a personal insult to everything he thought he had earned, yet he could not leave, for something deeper than anger compelled him to witness what came next. And so the girl stood ready, her rifle reloaded, her eyes scanning the altered landscape, and in her mind she recalled the long hours training not under instructors but under the watchful eye of her father, who had taught her that chaos was just another form of rhythm waiting to be discovered, that the trick to surviving a storm was not to fight it but to move in time with it. And so when the horn blared and the course came alive, with targets sliding, flipping, popping, disappearing behind cover, she did not hesitate, she flowed, each movement of her body in sync with the mechanical ballet of the course, her shots cracking out in perfect cadence. And what stunned the onlookers was not just her accuracy but her composure, the way she adjusted mid-breath, mid-step, never rushing, never lagging, as if the chaos itself were bowing to her will. And even when the smoke grenades hissed across the range, obscuring sight lines, her shots cut through them with uncanny precision, and the mocking man found himself leaning forward again, his mouth dry, his pride now fighting against the gnawing realization that he was watching something that shattered the very foundation of what he believed about skill and experience. And when the final buzzer sounded, there was a beat of silence, and then another as the results appeared on the overhead board, numbers that no one in that yard had ever seen, numbers that eclipsed not just passing scores but records, outright obliterating them, and the murmurs turned into a stunned roar, men who had trained for years shaking their heads in disbelief, some even clapping without realizing it, while the girl stood in the middle of it all, lowering her rifle, her breathing even, her face calm as though she had simply completed a chore. And the master stepped forward, his voice carrying now so that all could hear, "Every record," he said, slowly, each syllable deliberate, "every single SEAL shooting record has just been broken," and the weight of that truth slammed into the mocking man like a blow, because he remembered the days when his own scores had been considered untouchable, the pride he had taken in being the benchmark others were measured against, and now all of it had been swept aside in minutes by someone he had laughed at, someone he had dismissed as a joke, and though he wanted to hate her for it, a deeper, quieter voice inside him whispered a truth he could not ignore. He had just witnessed greatness and there was no shame in acknowledging it, yet pride is a parasite that clings, and so he swallowed hard, his jaw tight, his throat burning, while the girl, oblivious to the storm inside him, turned to the master and asked, softly, almost shyly, "Is there another level?" And the simplicity of the question nearly drew a laugh from the onlookers, but it was not mockery this time, it was awe, because only someone who saw the world in terms of horizons, not limits, could ask such a thing after dismantling the impossible, and the master, who had seen decades of soldiers, trainees and legends pass through his range, found himself at a loss, because there was no higher level, no harder test, not in this place, not in this context, and yet he knew that if there was, she would not rest until she faced it, and so he simply nodded once, his respect wordless, and in that nod the girl understood that her journey had only just begun. Word of what had happened on the range did not remain confined to the handful of men who had witnessed it, for extraordinary events carry their own wings, and by the following morning whispers had spread across the base, whispers that grew into rumors and rumors into sharp-edged stories until commanders and instructors who had not set foot near the training yard in months were suddenly curious about the girl who had appeared from nowhere and left the strongest shooters in the dust. And though the official line was that civilian visitors were not to be tested against SEAL standards, exceptions were sometimes made when something so unusual demanded attention. So when a black SUV rolled up that afternoon and two officers stepped out, men whose posture alone made the veterans on site straighten their spines, it was clear that the matter had traveled higher than anyone expected, and the mocking man, who had tried all night to drink away the bitter taste of humiliation, found himself standing rigid as the officers demanded to know if the stories were true, if a young girl had indeed dismantled every record without breaking a sweat, and the range master, a man who rarely wasted words, simply pointed to the board where the numbers glowed like gospel, and the officers' expressions hardened, not in disbelief but in the controlled calculation of men already planning the next step, for the military was built on hierarchies of ability, and when someone appeared who upset those hierarchies, the machinery moved quickly, and so the girl, who had come that morning expecting nothing more than another quiet practice, found herself standing before the officers as they studied her with eyes as sharp as knives, one of them asking her name, her age, her background, though none of her answers seemed to satisfy their silent hunger for understanding, and finally the taller officer said flatly, "You will demonstrate again," and there was no question in his tone, only command, and she nodded without hesitation, though inside she felt the faint stir of nerves, not from doubt in her ability but from the awareness that this was no longer a casual proving ground, this was official, recorded, the kind of moment that could define the rest of her life. So, when the course was reset and the crowd gathered again, larger now with instructors, trainees, and veterans pressing against the barriers to watch, she walked to the line with a steady stride, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring even the burning gaze of the mocking man who stood with clenched fists, caught between the desire to see her fail and the unavoidable truth that failure seemed impossible, and when the horn sounded she did what she always did, she surrendered to rhythm, her breathing and her heartbeat aligning with the sequence of moving targets, each shot snapping out with perfect control. But this time the officers did not only watch her scores, they watched the way she moved, the way she adjusted for wind before anyone else even noticed it had shifted, the way she compensated for recoil with micromovements so precise they looked effortless, and by the time the final buzzer rang and her score again surpassed every existing mark, the taller officer turned to the master and said quietly but firmly, "She's coming with us." And those words landed like thunder in the chest of the mocking man, because he understood immediately what they meant, that this girl, this stranger, was about to be pulled into a world few ever touched, a world he had once dreamed of himself before time and failures had left him on the outside, and though part of him wanted to object, to shout that she didn't belong, that she hadn't suffered enough, hadn't bled enough, another part of him, the part still honest despite pride's poison, knew she had earned whatever doors were opening for skill that pure could not be denied. And so he bit his tongue as the girl was escorted to the SUV, her rifle slung across her back, her eyes distant, already fixed on challenges none of them could yet imagine, and the crowd that had gathered parted silently as she passed, not with mockery this time but with a reverence usually reserved for legends, and though she did not seek their awe, did not bask in it, something inside her stirred, a recognition that her path had shifted forever, that the world she was stepping into was larger, darker, and more dangerous than the dusty range where it had begun, yet also the place where she truly belonged, and as the SUV pulled away, leaving behind silence broken only by the restless scuff of boots and the hollow click of rifles being set down, the mocking man finally exhaled, his chest heavy, his thoughts a tangled storm, and in that storm one truth cut through all else. He had not been defeated by her, not truly, he had been revealed, his limits laid bare against the limitless scope of her potential, and though bitterness gnawed at him, something else, something grudging and painful began to take root, the smallest seed of respect, for he knew now what the others were just beginning to realize, that she was not simply a prodigy or a lucky anomaly, she was a force, and forces do not fade quietly, they reshape the world around them. The drive in the black SUV seemed endless, the world outside shifting from familiar roads to restricted paths lined with fences and guards who checked IDs with sharp eyes, and though the girl sat quietly in the back, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her mind buzzed with the weight of what was happening, for she knew instinctively that this was no ordinary transfer, no simple demonstration, but something deeper, something that carried with it the gravity of recognition from powers she had never imagined would notice her, and when at last the vehicle stopped inside a facility hidden behind layers of concrete and steel, she stepped out into an air that felt heavier, thicker, as though the ground itself remembered the pressure of every test carried out here, and she saw around her men in uniform, men whose very movements radiated discipline, their eyes curious, skeptical, and in some cases hostile, because no one liked their records, their pride, their carefully cultivated aura of superiority to be threatened by an outsider, let alone a girl who looked as though she should still be walking a school hallway instead of a military installation. And yet here she was, her braids swaying against her back, her boots crunching against gravel as she followed the officers inside, through corridors lit with sterile white light, past rooms filled with equipment she had only seen in glimpses in her father's old manuals, until they arrived at a massive steel door that slid open with a mechanical groan, revealing an underground range unlike any she had ever seen, vast and complex, filled with modular obstacles, retracting walls, moving platforms and shadowed corners designed to simulate the chaos of real combat, and standing at the far end were the men she instantly recognized from their bearing alone. Active SEALs, their bodies forged by years of brutal training, their eyes sharp with suspicion and challenge, and one among them, tall, scarred, with a jaw that looked carved from stone, stepped forward and addressed the officers with clipped words, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding respect. "This is her?" And the taller officer simply nodded, replying, "She broke every record," and the silence that followed was heavy, like a storm cloud hanging low, until the scarred man chuckled. But it was not the easy laugh of amusement, it was the hard-edged sound of disbelief, and he said, "Then let's see if she can do it under pressure." And with that he gestured toward the range, signaling the technicians to power it up, and the girl, though she felt the tension pressing against her skin, did not hesitate, for hesitation was a weakness she had trained to erase. And as the lights shifted and the course roared to life, she lifted her rifle and moved, every muscle in her body tuned to the rhythm of chaos, bullets slicing the air, targets appearing and disappearing in split-second windows, smoke grenades flooding her vision, mechanical screams echoing from every angle, yet she did not falter, her shots snapping out with terrifying accuracy, her movements fluid as water, flowing between cover points as though she had walked this range 100 times before, and the SEALs who watched found themselves leaning forward despite themselves, their skepticism gnawed by the undeniable precision unfolding before their eyes, and when the final buzzer rang and the screens lit up with scores that once again shattered records, there was no laughter, no dismissive smirk, only a heavy, resentful silence, broken finally by the scarred man's voice, low and grudging, "Not bad," and though his words were minimal, the weight behind them was immense, for respect from men like him was not given easily. Yet before the girl could even lower her weapon, the door behind her opened again, and into the room stepped the last person she expected to see. The mocking man, his face hardened, his pride stitched together with the fragile thread of stubbornness, for he had followed, pulled strings, refused to fade into the background. And when the scarred SEAL looked at him with recognition, their eyes locking in a silent exchange that spoke of shared history, the girl realized with a sudden chill that the mocking man was not just some loudmouth veteran, he was once one of them. A man who had trained here, bled here, and though he had left under shadows she could not yet guess, his presence carried weight, and when he stepped forward, his voice was sharp, defiant. If she's to be tested, then she should face a real opponent. And the words cut through the room like a blade, drawing murmurs from the watching SEALs, for the implication was clear. He was challenging her, demanding a direct contest, and though the officers hesitated, calculating the risks, the scarred man's smirk returned, this time edged with cruel amusement. "Very well," he said, "let's see how she fares against one of our own," and the mocking man's eyes burned as he nodded. His pride now balanced on the edge of this trial, for he knew that if she bested him, In front of his former brothers, his legacy would be ashes, yet he could not walk away, not after what she had done to him, not after how she had unraveled the identity he had built brick by brick, and the girl, hearing all of this, felt no fear, only a steady calm, for she did not measure herself against his pride or his challenge, she measured herself only against the shot, the target, the rhythm of combat. And so when the range was reset for a two-person drill, the tension in the air was a living thing pressing against every chest in the room, and as the horn blared and both raised their weapons, the battle began, a storm of bullets, movement and raw will, the mocking man fighting not just to hit targets but to outpace her, to regain his dignity, while she moved with that same unshakable flow, her shots finding home again and again, and as the seconds bled away and the final buzzer screamed, the screens told the story no pride could silence. Her score was higher, cleaner, untouchable, and though he had fought with the desperation of a man clinging to the last shreds of his identity, it was not enough, it had never been enough, and as silence settled once more, heavier now with finality, the mocking man lowered his rifle slowly, his eyes locked on her with a mixture of fury, grief, and buried deep beneath, something dangerously close to respect, while the SEALs around them exchanged glances, their skepticism burned away, replaced by the grim acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just stepped into their world, something they could not deny, and the girl, calm as ever, simply lowered her rifle, exhaled, and asked in her quiet voice, "What's next?" And in that question, pure and fearless, every man in the room felt a chill, for they knew that her journey was only beginning, and whatever came next, none of them, not even the mocking man, would be able to stop it. The silence that followed her victory over the mocking man did not fade quickly. It lingered like smoke in the air, seeping into the lungs of every SEAL, officer, and observer who had watched the impossible unfold, and though the scarred man gave no outward sign of emotion, deep inside even he felt the unsteady shift of ground beneath his feet, because institutions as rigid as theirs thrived on predictability, on the careful hierarchy of experience, and the girl's presence was a crack in that foundation, a disruption that could not be ignored, and so the very next day she was summoned again, not to the underground range this time but to a room lined with monitors, its walls humming with the electricity of surveillance equipment and its air thick with the kind of tension that only comes before trials designed to push men beyond their limits, and the taller officer from before explained without ceremony, "You will run a simulation against a live team," and his words landed with the heavy inevitability of fate, for she understood immediately that this was no longer about proving skill with targets or competing against one embittered man, this was about survival, about demonstrating that her precision was not confined to sterile drills but could hold steady in the chaos of real combat dynamics, and though she simply nodded, her calm composure concealing the adrenaline coursing beneath, the mocking man, who had been allowed to remain as an observer, felt a bitter fire rekindle in his chest, because though she had bested him in public and stripped away his pride, the thought of watching her collapse against an entire SEAL unit gave him a cruel hope, a chance to see her humanity, her failure, and perhaps reclaim some fragment of his broken dominance. Yet what he and everyone else did not understand was that the girl had been preparing for this kind of chaos her entire life, not with elite technology or tactical playbooks, but with something older, rawer, the lessons drilled into her by her father, who had taught her that chaos was simply order in disguise, that no matter how fast or unpredictable the world moved, there was always a rhythm to find, a pattern to exploit, and so when she entered the simulation chamber, dressed now in combat gear that seemed almost absurd on her slight frame, she carried with her not nerves but that same eerie steadiness, her eyes sweeping the darkened room as the environment shimmered to life, holographic projections blending seamlessly with physical structures to create a sprawling urban battlefield, and as the horn blared and shadows shifted into the forms of men armed and moving with tactical precision, the onlookers leaned forward, the mocking man included, hungry to see her finally overwhelmed, but instead what they saw was something almost supernatural, a girl who moved not like a trainee, not like a soldier, but like a ghost threading through the cracks of a storm, her rifle barking in short, precise bursts, each round finding its mark before her opponents could adjust, her body weaving through cover with an instinct that seemed to place her always one step ahead, and though the SEAL team fought with the ruthless efficiency honed from years of combat drills, their frustration mounted as one by one they were tagged out of the exercise, their every coordinated push unraveled by her uncanny ability to anticipate, to outmaneuver, and to strike at the perfect moment, until finally, impossibly, the simulation ended with her standing alone in the middle of the digital battlefield. Breathing steady, rifle steady, her score flashing across the monitors in numbers that seemed unreal even to the programmers who had designed the system, and the room fell into stunned silence once again, broken only by the mocking man's low curse, his face twisted with disbelief and fury, for he had thought surely this would break her, surely this would expose her limits, and yet instead it had only widened the gulf between them, proving that what she carried was not some fluke of static drills but a talent that thrived in the very heart of chaos. And as the officers exchanged glances heavy with meaning, the scarred SEAL stepped forward, his voice rough, almost reluctant. "She's not just breaking records anymore," and his words carried the weight of a warning, because he understood what the others were just beginning to grasp, that talent like hers, unchecked and unmatched, could not simply be folded neatly into their system. It would either become their greatest asset or their greatest disruption. And as the girl lowered her weapon and calmly asked once more, "What's next?" the mocking man felt something inside him snap, because in that quiet question he heard not arrogance but inevitability, the sound of someone who had already accepted greatness as her path, and it filled him with a venomous envy that curdled into obsession, for he could not allow himself to be erased, not by her, not by the memory of his failure playing on repeat in the eyes of every man who had once looked up to him. And so while the officers deliberated, weighing her future in whispered tones, the mocking man's mind raced with darker thoughts, with plans and possibilities that twisted around his pride like barbed wire, because if he could not outshoot her, if he could not outlast her, then perhaps he could find another way to prove that she did not belong, a way that would remind everyone that legends could fall as easily as they rose. And though he masked his face with silence, inside him a storm raged, one that promised their story together was far from over. The officers knew they could not keep her confined to simulations forever, because numbers on a screen, no matter how impossible, could always be dismissed by skeptics as tricks of programming. And so after long hours of hushed deliberations, with voices rising and falling behind closed doors, they decided on the only path that could silence doubt. A live exercise, a field drill staged in an abandoned training town far from the base, where dust-stained buildings and crumbling streets had once echoed with the bootsteps of recruits, now reactivated into a labyrinth of combat scenarios designed to test every dimension of a soldier's will. And though such drills were usually reserved for advanced SEAL teams, the officers declared that she would face it alone, against opponents handpicked from their ranks, men who had proven themselves in countless exercises, some who had seen real combat and returned harder for it. And when word of this decision spread, the facility buzzed like a hive struck with a stick, some whispering that it was madness, others that it was necessary, but none able to deny that they wanted to see what would happen when the prodigy who had torn through their sacred numbers was thrown into something alive, unpredictable and merciless. And as preparations began, the mocking man felt his heart quicken, not with fear but with a poisonous thrill, for here at last was a stage where she might stumble, where her perfection might crack under the pressure of flesh and blood adversaries who could adapt, improvise and press harder than any simulation. And though part of him knew that if she triumphed even here it would destroy whatever fragments of superiority he clung to, another part craved it, needed to witness her undoing if only to soothe the endless gnawing inside him. And so he maneuvered, pulling favors and leaning on old connections until he secured a place as one of the opposing team. His presence explained away as the participation of a veteran familiar with the terrain, though in truth it was nothing more than obsession dragging him deeper into her orbit. And when the day arrived, the girl stood at the edge of the deserted training town, her rifle slung over her shoulder, the sun glaring down in merciless shafts of heat, her boots sinking into dust that smelled faintly of oil and decay. And though the gathered officers briefed her on the rules, eliminate the opposing force within a set time window, avoid capture, survive, she barely listened, for her mind was already calculating lines of sight, angles of cover, the weight of the rifle in her hands, the rhythm of her breathing. And when the horn blared, echoing through the hollow streets, she moved, not running wildly but gliding from shadow to shadow, every step deliberate, every movement precise, her senses alive to every shifting sound. And soon the opposition came, dark figures sweeping through alleys and doorways, rifles raised, voices murmuring in coded signals, and the battle began, bullets cracking against walls, dust erupting in clouds, shouts reverberating through empty buildings. Yet where others would have panicked, she thrived, slipping between corners like smoke, her shots ringing out in clean, surgical bursts that dropped one opponent after another, her instincts guiding her to places where cover and opportunity intersected. And those watching through drone feeds could scarcely believe what they were seeing, a lone figure dismantling an elite unit with such cold efficiency that it looked choreographed. But it was not choreography, it was something deeper, an instinct woven into her bones, a rhythm she had been dancing with her entire life. And as the minutes dragged on and the opposition thinned, frustration bled into their movements, mistakes crept into their tactics, and she capitalized on each one with merciless precision, until finally only one figure remained in the town's skeletal silence. The mocking man, his breath ragged, his pride a burning coal in his chest. His mind screaming that he could not lose again, not here, not in front of them all, and so he set a trap, retreating into one of the larger buildings, smashing glass, leaving false trails, baiting her into close quarters where her precision might falter. And for a moment he believed he had the upper hand, crouched in the shadows with his rifle steady, waiting for the telltale sound of her footsteps. But what he failed to understand, what he had always failed to understand, was that she did not move like others, did not follow the predictable paths pride assumed she would, and instead of walking into his snare, she circled, reading the signs of his desperation in the broken glass and scattered dust, and she climbed silently to the rooftop, moving with the fluid grace of someone born for shadows, and when at last he heard a creak behind him and spun, rifle snapping up, it was already too late, for she was above him, her weapon trained down, her eyes calm, steady, unshaken, and before he could pull the trigger, her shot cracked the air, tagging him clean in the chest plate, ending the exercise with a finality that echoed louder than the gunfire itself, and silence fell over the ruined town, silence so deep it felt as though the earth itself had paused to acknowledge what had happened. And in that silence the mocking man dropped his rifle, his shoulders sagging, his face twisted in an agony far beyond the sting of defeat, because this was no longer just about records or pride. This was about the unshakable truth that he had met someone who could not be broken, someone who had already surpassed him in every way, and as the officers declared the exercise complete, as the SEALs murmured their reluctant admiration, the girl simply lowered her rifle, exhaled slowly, and asked her question again, the same question she had asked at every stage, her voice calm, unshaken, terrifying in its simplicity. "What's next?" And those words carried across the dust and the ruined walls. Like a promise, a warning, and a prophecy, for everyone who heard them knew that whatever the answer, she was already prepared to face it. The footage from the exercise leaked faster than anyone anticipated, not because of negligence but because awe is a contagion, and those who had witnessed her dismantle a full SEAL team could not contain their disbelief, whispering, sharing fragments, until the story raced along channels far beyond the base, reaching the ears of commanders, analysts, and intelligence officials who lived in a world where every edge, every advantage, was currency more valuable than gold, and soon her name, still half hidden, still spoken in guarded tones, was being circulated in rooms where men in suits weighed the balance of nations, asking the same question she had been asking all along. What's next? And the answer they reached was inevitable. She would not be confined to drills or exercises anymore. She would be tested on missions, not real deployments yet, but shadow trials stitched into the fabric of operations too small to attract headlines, too risky for amateurs but perfect for measuring her potential. And so while the girl remained unaware of the political storm gathering around her, her days shifted subtly, her nights filled with briefings that grew sharper, more secretive, until she found herself boarding a plane one evening under the cover of darkness, her destination undisclosed, her task explained only in the barest of terms. Observe, report, neutralize if necessary, and though she nodded calmly, her mind sharp and ready, she felt something stir in her chest, a new rhythm, heavier, deeper. The knowledge that this was no longer about proving herself on a range but about walking into shadows where failure meant blood, not just numbers, and yet she did not flinch, because in her heart she had always known this was the path she was walking toward, that the bullet and the breath and the silence were not meant for games but for the crucible of reality, and while she embraced this next step with the same quiet resolve, the mocking man sank deeper into a darkness of his own making, for every success she carved into the world was a blade across his pride, reopening wounds he thought scarred over, and in the quiet of his quarters he stared at the mirror, seeing not himself but the reflection of failure, a ghost of the man who had once been feared, respected, and now reduced to the butt of whispers, his name spoken only in contrast to hers, and pride curdled into obsession, obsession into hatred, until the thought of watching her succeed became unbearable, and he began to scheme, his mind latching onto bitter fantasies of sabotage, betrayal, anything that could prove her unworthy, anything that could remind the world she was mortal, and in his desperation he reached out to contacts he should never have called, men on the fringes, men who had no allegiance but to chaos, and though he told himself he was doing it to protect the sanctity of the brotherhood, to remind them all that greatness could not be handed to a girl who had not paid the price of blood, the truth, festering beneath every word, was that he simply could not stand being forgotten, erased by her shadow, and as the girl returned from her first mission, silent, successful, precise as always, the mocking man watched from a distance, his envy gnawing at him, his thoughts darker with each passing day, and those around him began to notice the way his jaw tightened whenever her name was spoken, the way his fists clenched when others replayed her feats, yet no one confronted him, for men built from pride rarely admit their cracks until it is too late, and so the storm inside him grew unchecked, while she, oblivious to the rot of his obsession, pushed forward, her legend expanding quietly, whispers of her accuracy reaching ears in places she had never seen, until one night she sat alone cleaning her rifle, the familiar ritual soothing her heartbeat, and she thought not of glory, not of the awe she inspired, but of the same simple truth her father had once told her, that the bullet never lies, that skill is nothing if not matched by purpose, and though she did not yet know it, that purpose would soon be tested in ways that would demand more than precision, more than rhythm, for the mocking man's schemes were already moving like shadows under the door, seeping into the corridors of command, and those who had once dismissed him as a bitter relic would soon realize he had become something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose. The betrayal did not come like thunder but like a whisper, creeping through cracks no one had thought to seal, subtle at first, strange miscommunications in briefings, equipment delays that felt too precise to be accidents, and a growing sense that someone within the circle wanted her to stumble. But the girl did not dwell on paranoia. She carried on, focused as always, until the night of the mission that would decide everything, the one they told her was nothing more than another test, a hostage rescue staged in a derelict industrial complex on the outskirts of a forgotten city. But as soon as she stepped into the shadows of the sprawling steel skeleton, rifle steady in her hands, she knew this was different, the silence too heavy, the layout too alive, and when the first shot cracked the air, it was not the harmless paint round of a drill but a bullet meant to kill, sparking off metal inches from her head, and in that instant the truth crystallized. This was no simulation, this was betrayal, a trap woven so carefully into the exercise that only she was meant to be caught, and somewhere in the darkness, watching through scopes and shadows, was the mocking man, his plan finally unfurling, for he had fed intel to the kind of men the military never admitted existed, mercenaries with no flag but money, their presence explained away as unexpected variables. And his intent was simple, brutal. Either she would fall and her legend with her, or she would survive but bloodied, exposed as nothing more than luck stretched too thin. Yet what he had forgotten, what his pride had blinded him to, was that she had never been fueled by luck, only by rhythm, instinct, and the unbreakable calm of a mind that did not fear chaos. And so as the complex erupted into gunfire and the air filled with the hiss of ricochets and the pounding echo of boots on steel, she moved, not panicked, not desperate, but steady, weaving through beams and shadows with surgical precision, every shot she fired claiming space, every step turning the ambush into her battlefield. And though the mercenaries pressed hard, trained and ruthless, they fell one after another, undone by her uncanny ability to read their movements before they made them, until the mocking man, watching from above with sweat stinging his eyes, realized with a sick twist in his gut that even here, even in the crucible of betrayal, she was unstoppable, and desperation clawed at him, dragging him from the shadows into the fight itself, for he could no longer stand apart, no longer watch her dismantle everything he had built his hatred on. And so he stormed into the steel labyrinth with his rifle tight in his grip, his breath ragged, his pride howling louder than the gunfire, and when their eyes met through the haze of smoke and sparks, it was as though time itself paused, the mocking man seeing not the girl he had once mocked but the force she had become, and the girl seeing not an opponent, but the embodiment of everything she had been told she could not do, could not be, and then the battle ignited between them, brutal and unrelenting, his shots wild but fueled by the raw fury of pride, hers calm, measured, the rhythm of inevitability, and they moved through the steel jungle like predators circling, until at last his rage drove him too far, exposing him in the open, and her shot cracked out, clean and final, striking his vest squarely in the chest, the force dropping him to the ground with the breath torn from his lungs, and the complex fell into silence once more, the last echoes of gunfire fading into the hollow night, and as she lowered her rifle, breathing steady despite the storm she had endured, the mercenaries scattered, broken, their mission undone, and the officers who had been monitoring from afar poured into the